Good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's afternoon in the UK from Manchester. I'm Sally Hickson. I'm a lecturer in education development in health sciences. I'll let Nikki and Jen introduce themselves quickly as well.
I'm Nikki. Hi, I'm a lecturer in microbiology at the University of Manchester.
And I'm Jen McBride, also from the University of Manchester, and I'm a senior lecturer, and my discipline background is cognitive neuroscience and experimental psychology.
So we're going to talk to you today about a project that we started at Manchester called the Enhancing Assessment Review, now very affectionately known as the EAR project. Jen, Nikki and I set up a small team to work with programs or to make ourselves available to programs across the university to look objectively and holistically at their assessment strategies across the program. And we're going to go through our pilot phase with you and just share with you some of our findings and what worked well and what some of the challenges were. So at Manchester, we've got 3 faculties, and in each of those faculties, there are 3 schools. And in the School of Biological Sciences, where Nikki is from, she volunteered her school for the EAR team to look at their assessment strategies. Now, the School of Biological Sciences has around 15 undergraduate programs, but it's very much a modular-based suite of programs where programs can weave their own way through, students can weave their own way through a wide variety of optional units, course units, or modules, you may call them. So most programs have a few core or compulsory units, and then there's a wide variety of optional units that students can navigate through. There are around 400 assessment points across years 1 and 2 of the program, 15 undergraduate programs, 65 course units that we reviewed as part of the review program. And there's about 2,000 students in the School of Biological Sciences undergrad provision. So it's quite a big project that we started off. And we had an initial pilot that we'll talk to you about in a second. And then we looked at the whole school as a whole. And it was basically based on those few reasons at the bottom of that slide of sort of perennial low NSS scores from students around assessment and feedback. I think many of us in the higher education sector struggle with getting it right for our students in terms of assessment and feedback. There was also a perception from students and staff and external examiners about over-assessment, and then the knock-on impact of that about workload for students and for staff in terms of marking as well. And the colleagues in the School of Biological Sciences, and I'm sure colleagues certainly wider in the university and maybe in your own organisation, were really willing to and keen to address these assessment and feedback issues, but some reported lacking expertise or capacity, didn't have the time, probably due to the perception of over-assessment. So just in terms of the composition of the EAR team, what we found worked really well, and this was just from the pilot that we set up where Jen, Nikki and I formed a team. We really felt that having someone external to the program or to the school where the program is based as a critical friend was crucial and vital. I'm not attached to the School of Biological Sciences. I'm actually in the same faculty, but in health sciences. And Jen's also from health sciences, although she does have some background in biological sciences. And having that externality was really important because we could ask those sometimes challenging and sometimes naive questions. Why is it this way? Why is it that way? Have you thought about this or that? So we found that really important. And then Nikki is the Director of Education for the School of Biological Sciences. So having someone with an overarching knowledge, local expertise was really crucial. So that's kind of the team composition that we're going to encourage as we roll out across the university. When we worked with the School of Biological Sciences, we developed some guiding principles with them and sort of looked at them from a wide, holistic point of view, wanting to make sure that we met what they needed to be done with their assessment strategies. And we anticipate that these principles will be adaptable to other schools and other programs as we roll this out across the university. And these are the things that we looked at. We looked at timeliness of assessment and feedback. When are the assessment deadlines? When are the opportunities for feedback? And do those work? We also looked at the number of assessment points, the size of those assessment points, as well as their respective weighting. If there were more than one assessment within a course unit, we looked at whether the weighting was appropriate or not. Constructive alignment was a really key important principle of this process, making sure that the assessments really assess the learning outcomes in the best way. And sometimes we took a programmatic view, looking at skill development and knowledge development and thinking, well, this assessment has really, this skill has been over-assessed, particularly in this year. Maybe we could diversify that and test some other skills in the learning outcomes as well. Then we looked at variety of assessment, optionality in terms of, did we have essay topics that students could choose, for example, questions in an exam, or even choosing between assessment type A and assessment type B to assess their learning outcomes. And we also looked at where we could explore authenticity in terms of making assessments more applicable to the working world when students graduate. That's what we mean by authenticity. And in the School of Biological Sciences, you would think would be very practically based. So there was a lot of variety and, oh, the word slipped my mind, but where we could really introduce some exciting new assessments. Those three principles really helped in our recommendations. We also considered inclusivity for students. We've got a wide variety of students, a large student group, particularly in this school. How could our assessments be more inclusive and accessible to them? And finally, but most importantly, very, very important, that we incorporated the student's voice. What did they want from an assessment strategy? How did they feel assessments played to their strengths and enabled them to demonstrate their attainments of the learning outcomes? I'm going to hand over to Nikki next.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, so before we kind of dived in really and looked at every single assessment that we run in the School of Biological Sciences, we set up a pilot study, which is the Year 1 pilot. And we just looked at 2 of our degree programs. We picked 2 that were entirely different. We looked at zoology and we looked at pharmacology. And we picked Year 2 of both programs because there's quite a diverse range of units in our second year of our degree, and we focused on semester 1, and that was a relatively quick process. We covered everything in 6 weeks. We looked at all the mandatory course units for both of those degrees, and we looked at all of the assessments contained with them. We made decisions when we found there was over assessment, and we met with all the unit coordinators who are running those assessments and to suggest changes. And I think that one of the things that was quite nice about the process is we expected to get quite a lot of pushback from unit coordinators. People often really don't want to be, let's not say told what to do, but they don't like external suggestions. But actually our experience was incredibly positive, and we had some really good conversations with people. And we rolled out those changes. We put them through our internal approval processes in March. And then, sorry, my son is standing by the window just here, wanting to be let into the house. So very distracting. So we pushed everything through, and this beginning of this academic year, those changes were all in place, and we had some really great feedback from students. So that kind of pushed us on to have a much more substantial review of assessments. So we then went on to look at every single assessment in Year 2 and Year 3 of all of our 15 degrees. That's like 69 course units in total. We went through the same process. We looked at every single assessment, dissected it. We also looked at the timing of assessments. One of the issues we wanted to resolve was bunching of assessment deadlines. So all of that kind of little bits of detail were included in these projects. We use student feedback and to get a student voice, so that the things that we thought would improve things are not always the things that students think will improve things. I think Sally's going to elaborate on all of that now.
So so that second process took about 6 months, and I'll just go through that process with you now. We had an initial period of gathering information. We started in September last year. And we gathered everything really, all the assessment data that we could get our hands on in terms of type of assessment, weighting, the due dates, feedback dates, and we had a massive spreadsheet with all of that. We tried to do some interesting diagrams and sort of data presentations on that information as well. We also gathered all the course units or the modules, intended learning outcomes, to then sort of align assessments with learning outcomes, to look at those together. We also looked at student unit evaluations, student feedback data from those to see what information we could glean from those. We also incorporated data from someone in the School of Biological Sciences who's pulled together some really, really rich, interesting data around awarding gaps and attainment to see what types of assessments might need to be looked at and where some issues might have arisen from that. So really interesting data that came out of that. And as I've said before, we incorporated the student voice. We had a fantastic cohort of student reps who were really engaged in seeking advice from their groups. Some of them held focus groups. We then went and met with the student rep teams themselves. So some really, really good dialogue. And you'll see from the next slide that we engaged quite a lot with them. So sort of between October and November, December time, we went through rounds and rounds of consultations. And these are sort of the types of people that we went through the consultation with. The program directors from 15 of the programs, we met with them several times at each stage in the process and agreed those principles that I introduced to you at the beginning, agreed the process, analysed the data and all of that. And then we asked program directors for their feedback at every stage that we made recommendations. We had several meetings with them. We also had one-to-one sessions with them, and obviously we were open to being contacted at any time. The program directors then reviewed the recommendations that we made with their program teams and the unit coordinators, and those then came back to us as well. And we created some one-to-one workshop sessions with unit coordinators just to come and talk to us about their ideas, about the challenges, or the implementation of any of the recommendations. And then we met repeatedly with student reps and the wider student cohorts and various working groups to understand what their priorities were for assessment. And then almost the nuts and bolts of the work was us as an EAR team reviewing all the assessment data and coming through with some recommendations. We went through unit by unit, assessment by assessment, looking at them individually, but also bearing in mind overarching program learning outcomes, trying to keep those in our sight as well. And we kept going back to our agreed principles now and just reminding ourselves almost what was in scope or what wasn't in scope, and just keeping to those principles as well. And then in January, we made our first set of recommendations to the program directors, and we discussed them. We asked them for some feedback. We also shared those recommendations to student focus groups to see if what they thought of the recommendations we were making. And then in February, we made our revised draft 2 recommendations, which were then approved and taken through the school's Quality Assurance Committee, their teaching board, in March. Now I'm going to hand over to Jen, who's going to talk about the outcome and the impact.
Thanks very much, Sally. So in total for EAR 2.0, if you like, where we rolled it out across the School of Biological Sciences, we'd reviewed 65 units. So when we talk about units, what we're talking about is a module here. So different colleagues use different terms. And of those 65 units or modules, 46 of the unit coordinators accepted the recommendations that we made or suggested something slightly different that was still in keeping with the goals of the review. One unit was new, so it was replacing an existing unit, and the EAR team provided advice to that unit coordinator on how that assessment might be best set up. We had 4 units choose to delay adopting the recommendations. Now, typically that was because of a change in curriculum or a change in unit staff, and they wanted to embed that and to include the new unit team in these discussions. 5 units had very recently changed their assessment, and quite understandably, they wanted to see how that went before they introduced a further change. So of the 65 units, only 6 unit coordinators declined to make any changes to their assessments after we provided recommendations, and 3 did not respond. Can I have the next slide, Sally, please? Thank you. So we have prepared just a couple of tables which highlight the outcomes, or the impact, if you like, of the assessment changes that have been made. So what this table is showing is for year 2 and year 3 in separate columns, with a sum or the total in that rightmost column, the number of units which are making different kinds of changes to their assessment. Now, of course, some units will be in more than one of these particular rows, because some units changed quite a lot about their assessment, whereas some of them would change something smaller. But for example, in total, we had 23 units who removed a substantial piece of assessment. So this would be something like a coursework essay or a significant component to an exam, for example. We had 3 units that would keep the assessment but would reduce the size or the scope of it, so it would be made smaller. And 2 units removed a short answer component, so something that was marked by members of staff, typically from an exam. So the ones that we have in green here at the bottom, towards the bottom of this table, are those units that added something in their assessment. So you can see that 8 units here added a new piece of coursework to their assessment. And typically this was not an essay. This was something like an infographic abstract or an essay plan. It was something more creative than we might see in a typical essay. Some increased the scope of an existing piece of coursework, and a couple of units have actually now introduced generative AI as a component to their assessment deliberately. Some have added a short answer or a multiple answer question element to a test. And at the bottom here, we've gone through and calculated the number of summative assessment points that have been removed across units in this review. And in total, that's 101 different summative assessment points that have been removed through this process. And if I could have the next slide, Sally, please. And of course, we have different numbers of students who are enrolled on these units. So we thought it would be helpful to show how many students or how many pieces of assessment, if you like, rather than just the number of units. So in this table, we have multiplied the number of students enrolled on the units by the number of units themselves. So you can see that in essence, we have removed, if we just look at that top right cell there, 1,732 different essays if you multiply it across the number of students. So you can see that in total here, we've had quite a significant impact from the students' point of view of the assessment and the assessment changes that have been made.
Good, thank you. And it's over to Nikki.
Over to Nikki.
Yeah, so I mean, as kind of Jen pointed out, the amount of change we made was quite substantial, and you know, it wasn't really. Although one of the purposes of EAR was to reduce assessment burden in students, it was also to reduce marking burden in staff, because I think staff feel almost as equally burdened by assessment as students, but although in a different way. And I think the changes that we made had a phenomenal impact really on staff marking burden. So, you know, Jen has done these calculations, not me. But you know, we're estimating 68 days in total of fewer marking, and you know, 506 fewer marking hours per academic year. But I think 68 fewer days of marking, that is going to have a massive impact on the staff teaching on these course units. And I think that will free staff up to do other things that might enhance their units. It will make them feel kind of happier and more enthusiastic. So I think that for me was a real positive that came out of this. And certainly in terms of, you know, management in the school were very kind of delighted by the kind of relief of marking burden from our staff. And I think the other thing that came out of it was, you know, what a really fantastic job some of our staff were doing. I think one of the things that we forget, particularly if you're kind of leading or managing a kind of big range of programs, is that, you know, you've got people out there who are doing fantastic things, but you don't necessarily see that. And particularly in the field of assessment is, I would say, kind of a Cinderella element of the kind of whole educational process. It's very much hidden. It's in the bowels of the submarine, and we don't really see it. But going through the year processing, we uncover some phenomenal examples of creativity, infographic abstracts, a museum project, amazing exams where staff had put in a huge amount of time to design really great kind of problem-based exam papers that really kind of assessed the understanding and kind of ability of students to go through kind of critical analysis. And so, yeah, and authentic assessments as well. So we were able to take these things and kind of share that best practice with our other staff. And so from my point of view, as a kind of director of education, you know, seeing all of this was really, really fantastic. And I think we don't thank our staff enough for the work they put into designing assessments. And this enabled us to do that.
I think that's still you, Nikki.
As well. So I think the other thing that we looked at from EAR that made me personally rethink, with the help of Sally and Jen, is that, you know, we have to assess everything culture. So one of the things we had, which is like a hallmark of our examination process in final year or in year 2, was you must answer 2 questions from a choice of 5. And kind of Jen and Sally said, well, why do you have to answer 2? You know, why can't it be 1? And initially, you know, I could feel my, you know, feet sticking in the mud. I wasn't really open to that idea. And another colleague said that, you know, well, actually, what we surely are doing is laying out our wares to students, allowing them maybe to pick things that they're really interested in and to explore those in more detail. So do we have to get them to write 2 essays to show that they understand, I don't know, Introduction to Virology, one of my units? Will one do it with some other assessments in the background? So it kind of changed our culture. The other thing that we had was we didn't like seeing MCQ exams in year 2. We felt that we run them in year 1, and we felt that MCQs were, you know, not high enough Bloom's pyramid really for year 2. They were far too information gathering and not enough critical analysis. But what we decided to do with EAR was actually to bring some MCQs into year 2 and to have assessments which were a balance of, you know, breadth of knowledge acquired, measured by MCQ, complemented by more in-depth assessments, you know, which would be essay-based or exam-based, and that really worked as well. We also have some staff who introduced some really great assessments, which enabled us to use AI in a positive way, which was really, really nice to see. And we also, we inevitably thought a lot about how our changes would be impacted by any academic malpractice that could be put into place by misuse of Gen AI. And I think the other thing that we really considered was MIT-CIRCS procedures. So we have in Manchester a situation whereby you can only mitigate 30% of a course unit. So anything that's worth more than 30% of a course unit, you have to do as a resit, and you can't just kind of ignore those marks because maybe a student's been ill, but you know, if you're anything over 30, they would have to resit. So I think that kind of did rather kind of, what's the word I'm trying to kind of force it into a situation where perhaps we couldn't do the things we really wanted to do. And we limited the idea of splitting 50-50 exam assessment. We kind of limited that because of MIT-CIRCS procedures within the school.
Great, thanks. And Jen?
Thank you very much. So we, as I can't remember if it was Sally or Nikki now, as one of us mentioned earlier, these revisions to assessment have been approved through all the usual quality assurance processes in the university. But of course, we have not actually implemented them yet. They will be implemented this coming September. So it's too early for us to know for certain how these are going to go with students and with staff in the next academic year. And we're going to be keeping a very close eye on that. All signs so far have been positive, but we're planning further evaluation. So we are intending to monitor the student evaluations for the different course units, as well as student enrolments on optional units, because we know from talking to our students that one of the things they really take into account when they're selecting their optional modules is how those modules are going to be assessed. So let's keep an eye on the ways that students vote with their feet, given these new assessments that have been introduced. We'll also be looking at the rates of completion of formative assessments, and if an assessment that was previously summative has become formative, is that going to have an impact on student marks, and do those differences in marks land equally? The last thing we'd want to do is to widen any awarding gaps here, and we're going to be keeping a very close eye on that. We're also already planted the seeds to keep an eye on the number of mitigating circumstances applications. If we've reduced the number of assessments, we would hope that the number of mitigating circumstances requests might also go down, but it's something we need to consider very carefully. And of course, we'll also consider the final unit marks for students who've undergone these new assessments relative to previous years. We will also evaluate what our students and our colleagues are telling us about their experiences of these new assessments. So we will continue to monitor student feedback at meetings, so things such as our student voice meetings, where we used to call them staff student liaison committee meetings. I'm sure colleagues on the floor will have similar procedures, and those can often give us insights far earlier than we would expect to see in something like the National Student Survey or NSS, but of course we'll be keeping an eye on that in the years to come as well. We're also going to be continuing to talking to our staff and having their perceptions on these assessments, along with the impacts on their workload. Again, what we've learned from our pilot of just those 4 units in ER 1.0 is that staff so far have been really positive about the changes that we've made, but this is not all over and done with and complete, and we'll continue to keep an eye on that, as well as any relevant comments from our external examiners. So in terms of next steps and evaluation, so what are we doing next in this place? So far, the team of reviewers has comprised 3 of us. The 3 of us on this call, it's been Sally, Nikki and me. And it's been quite a considerable undertaking that we have incorporated into our existing workloads. But in order for this to be scalable and roll-outable in other places across the university, we'd need some support to do that. So conversations in that space are ongoing. So we are considering a train the trainer kind of approach, where we might establish a small team of review colleagues to adopt this similar framework in a similar model, perhaps in each faculty, or perhaps a central team that can be used flexibly in the different faculties. And we're also considering how this might be embedded into our usual continuous improvement processes. So things like our continuous monitoring processes, as well as our periodic review of programs, and whether this process actually could be embedded and become business as usual in those existing mechanisms. But we'd also like to keep the option for one-off or kind of ad hoc requests, if you like. If a programme would like some support in this space, then it really would be a shame to say that we can't provide that because we've embedded it into something else if they'd like something sooner. And of course, we're starting to disseminate it through events like this webinar. And just, I think this is the final word from me. We asked our colleague in the School of Biological Sciences, it's actually one of Nikki's deputies. So this is the Deputy Director of Education who has particular responsibility for curricula. And we asked her if she would provide us with an honest reflection of her experiences of the EAR process. And she says that having an external team manage the process, data analysis and formulate the recommendations was crucial, as was the one-to-one support offered to unit coordinators making changes to their unit assessment. The very high level of input and engagement from the EAR team was instrumental in getting the process off the ground and seeing it through to completion in time for it to be implemented for 25-26. And I think it is just worth noting here that we began this process across these 65 units in September of this year, and it was done and through the QA processes by the end of February. So it's a fairly quick process.
Great, thanks, Jen.
That's
just a summary slide. I just want to give 2 minutes for any questions and leave that there. But that also just that we'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in the approach, want to hear any more, please feel free to contact us. I'm sure Ansel will share the presentation. So that's all from us.